Question number 5, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, when he said in the House, quote, get some guts, was he talking to opposition parties or the Iraqi army, which has been in retreat for the last 2 months and was routed at Ramadi by a force they outnumbered 10 to 1?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, well, really specifically I was speaking to the Leader of the Opposition, who I think in his heart of hearts knows the right thing for this country to do on a bipartisan basis is actually to stand up to the people who undertake these atrocities, and I hope he will eventually see it our way because we are right on this side of the House.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement, quote, if Iraq is to gain control of its cities, it will need strong and well-trained forces, end of quote. If so, does he not realise that you can't train cowards to fight?
Honourable Prime Minister.
In terms of the first part of the question, yes, you do need strong forces. In terms of the latter part of the question, I think the member should really probably reflect on that. To put that generalisation across a whole country's population is either foolhardy or harsh. He can choose which one he prefers.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
To the Prime Minister, when he received his most recent briefing from Defence on Iraq, did that briefing state that there was a possibility that our troops would be surrounded at Camp Taji?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I'm not going to go into the individual briefings I get because I think that wouldn't be in the national interest to do so. But what I am quite prepared to say is that the safety and security of our men and women who are in Taji Air Base is our #1 priority. That there is work obviously done to make sure we continually assess that situation. There are a variety of trigger points that we would look at if we thought that it was appropriate to bring our people home, and we've always said that we would do that. But I'm quite comfortable in the advice I have at the moment that notwithstanding it's obviously a dangerous environment in Iraq, that our people are in the safest position they can be actually in Taji Air Base.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with the US Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Martin Dempsey, who said, quote, the Iraqi security force was not driven out of Ramadi, they drove out of Ramadi?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be a Monday morning quarterback on what happened in Ramadi, but I have seen the comments from Prime Minister al-Badi, who says that they're keen to retake that ground. Certainly the advice that we've had is some ground is lost and some ground is gained. But if you take a step back on the overall thing, if the member's logic is followed to the obvious conclusion, what he's basically saying is that Iraq should surrender itself to ISIL. And I simply say to the member, if he thinks that isn't going to increase the risks to New Zealanders, then it's really unbelievable. And if the member wants to go out there and tell New Zealanders that he's quite prepared through his own inactions to put them at greater risk, then he's welcome to go and campaign on doing that, but he'll run a million miles from that when I start pointing it out publicly, and that's what I intend to do.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister. Does he think that troops that flee and leave tanks and artillery worth millions of dollars behind, and troops that flee when they outnumber the enemy 10 to 1 are able and capable of being trained to fight?
Insofar as this Prime Ministerial responsibility, Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, all I can say is if you listen to the CDF, he is not only very confident of the training capability that our people have, he's seen that demonstrated in a place like Afghanistan where we have made a difference, and I'm confident actually time will make a difference in improving the skills of the Iraqis.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, what is the Prime Minister's view of Ash Carter, the United States Defence Secretary, who said, quote, what apparently happened is the Iraqi forces just showed no will to fight. They were not outnumbered. In fact, they vastly outnumbered the opposing force. That says to me, and I think most of us, that we have an issue with the will of Iraqis to fight ISIS and to defend themselves. What's the Prime Minister's view of that statement?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am the Prime Minister of New Zealand, not a commentator on what other politicians around the world say.
Supplementary. Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
To the Prime Minister, does he not realise that he sent our brave New Zealand soldiers to Iraq on a fool's errand, and that training the Iraqi army to stand and fight is literally mission impossible?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no. What I do think is that ISIL presents a threat, not only in the region actually, but I think it presents a regional threat to countries that New Zealanders travel to, and I think it presents a domestic threat. And the member can sit there all he likes and say that we should abdicate our responsibilities and do nothing. But I simply say to the member that would put them at greater risk. And I think actually if you look at the public polling that's been undertaken in this matter, the most recent poll that we saw with the New Zealand Herald indicated that on a ratio of 3 to 1, New Zealanders actually do think that we should do something to protect ourselves from people who are abhorrent. If the member doesn't believe in doing that, I'm quite surprised, because he's a former military man, and I would have thought he would have understood that.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
When the Prime Minister said that the trigger for changing his stance on deployment to Iraq was if the New Zealand Defence Force thought there was an absolute threat, quote unquote, to New Zealand troops, how does he define absolute threat?
Right
Speaker,
Honourable Prime
That's
Minister.
the very point. I don't. They decide that. They're the ones that tell us, through their advice, on the back of our advice, we will decide whether they come or no, but they define the risks.
Question. Order. Order.